Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to your first Cornell Notes mini lesson for British Literature, English 12 at Jenison International Academy. If you need a reminder on how to take your Cornell Notes, great opportunity within this folder where you're clicking on the video down a couple of items. You can click right there and you can find a tutorial that will remind you on the importance of Cornell Notes and how to proceed there. Mini lessons are going to take place over the course of both semesters, just as a way to give us some historical context and background to what we're studying. As you take those notes, you're going to notice that this year especially, from English 10 and English 11, these Cornell notes are going to focus more on the verbal, where you're picking up more information. And that's because we're becoming seniors, we're getting into English 12 a little bit more, and it's a higher rigor where you have to figure out what's important and what you have to write down in those notes. So they're not as laid out, but all the information is still there for you. If you have questions, be sure to reach out to your instructors, and we're here to help you out as necessary. A towering circle of ancient stones, draped in the mist of centuries, the clatter of horses' hoofs, the clash of swords and spears. A tiny island whose motley tongue would become the language of the world, and whose laws, customs, and literature would help form Western civilization. This is England, and the story begins here. The Dark Ages, as the Anglo-Saxon period is often called, was a time of bloody conflicts, ignorance, violence, and barbarism. Life was difficult, and the literature of the period reflects that reality. Little imagery of the brief English summers appears in this literature. Winter prevails and spring comes slowly, if at all. The people were serious-minded, and the reader finds scarce humor in their literature. Indeed, many of the stories and poems present heroic struggles in which only the strong survive. And no wonder. The first person ever to write about England may have been the Roman general Julius Caesar, who in 55 BC attempted to conquer the British Isles. Put off by fierce Celtic warriors, Caesar hastily claimed victory for Rome and returned to Europe, leaving the Britons, as the people were known, and their neighbors to the north and west, the Picts and Gales, in peace. A century later, however, the Roman army returned in force and made good Caesar's claim. Britain became a province of the great Roman Empire, and the Romans introduced cities, roads, written scholarship, and eventually Christianity to the island. The rule lasted more than 300 years. Romanized Britons adapted to an urban lifestyle, living in villas and frequenting public baths, and came to depend on the Roman military for protection. Then, early in the 5th century, the Romans pulled out of Britain, called home to help defend their beleaguered empire against hordes of invaders. With no central government or army, it was not long before Britain, too, became a target for invasion. The Angles and Saxons, along with other Germanic tribes, began arriving from northern Europe around AD 449. The Britons, perhaps led by a Celtic chieftain named Arthur, likely the genesis of the legendary King Arthur of myth and folklore, fought a series of battles against the invaders. Eventually, however, the Britons were driven to the west, Cornwall and Wales, the north of Scotland, and across the English Channel to an area of France that became known as Brittany. Settled by the Anglo-Saxons, the main part of Britain took on a new name, Angleland, or England. Anglo-Saxon culture became the basis for English culture, and their guttural, vigorous language became the spoken language of the people, the language now known as Old English. It's interesting to point out here that when we read Shakespeare and when we get into certain pieces, people will say, I can't read this, this is in Old English. Old English is still English, it's just in a form that's more primal and the base of how we speak today as well. The 1790s brought the next wave of invaders, a fearsome group of seafaring marauders from the rocky, windswept coasts of Denmark and Norway. They were the Vikings. Shrieking wildly and waving giant battle axes, Viking raiders looted, killed, and burned down entire villages. At first, they hit and ran, but later, finding England a more pleasant spot to spend the winter than their icy homeland, the Danish invaders set up camps and gradually gained control of much of the north and east of the country. In the south, the Danes finally met defeat at the hands of a powerful Anglo-Saxon king known as Alfred the Great. Alfred unified the English, and under his rule, learning and culture flourished. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of English history, was initiated at his bidding. A piece from that reads, William returned to Hastings and waited there to know whether the people would submit to him. But when he found that they would not come to him, he went up with all his force that was left, and that came since to him from oversea, and ravaged all the country. You see, in 1042, a descendant of Alfred took the throne, the deeply religious Edward the Confessor. Edward, who had no children, had once sworn an oath making his French cousin William, Duke of Normandy, his heir, or so William claimed. When Edward died, however, a council of nobles and church officials chose an English earl named Harold to succeed him. Incensed by this, William led his Norman army in what was to be the last successful invasion of the island of Britain, the Norman Conquest. Harold was killed at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and on Christmas Day of that year, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England. If you remember one date from this class, ladies and gentlemen, 1066, the Norman Conquest, the beginning of Britain as we know it today. The Norman Conquest ended Anglo-Saxon dominance in England. As they lost their land to their conquerors, noble families sank into peasantry, and a new class of privileged Normans took their place. Early Anglo-Saxon literature reflected a fatalistic worldview, while later works were influenced by rapidly spreading Christianity. You see, like all cultures, that of the Anglo-Saxons changed over time. It progressed. The early invaders were seafaring wanderers whose lives were bleak, violent, and they were short. Their pagan religion was marked by a strong belief in weird, or fate, and they saved their admiration for heroic warriors whose fate it was to prevail in battle. As the Anglo-Saxons settled into their new land, however, they became an agricultural people, less violent, more secure, and more civilized. The bleak fatalism of the Anglo-Saxons' early beliefs may have reflected the reality of their lives, but it offered little hope. Life was harsh, it taught, and the only certainty was that it would end in death. Christianity, rather, opened up a bright new possibility, that the suffering of this world was merely a prelude to the eternal happiness of heaven. Christianity, you see, takes hold. No one knows exactly when the first Christian missionaries arrived in Britain, but by 300 AD, the number of Christians on the island was significant. Over the next 2 centuries, Christianity spread to Ireland and to Scotland, and from Scotland to the Picts and Angles in the north. In 597, a Roman missionary named Augustine arrived in the kingdom of Kent, where he established a monastery at Canterbury. From there, Christianity spread so rapidly that by 690, all of Britain was at least nominally Christian, though many still held on to that pagan tradition and belief. Monasteries became centers of intellectual, literary, artistic, and social activity. At times when schools and libraries were completely unknown, monasteries offered the only opportunities for education. Monastic scholars imported books from the continent, which then they painstakingly copied page by page, word by word, letter by letter. In addition, original works were written mostly in scholarly Latin, but later in Old English. The earliest recorded history of the English people came from the clergy at the monasteries. The greatest of these monks was the Venerable Bede, author of a history of the English church and people. When Vikings invaded in the late 8th and 9th centuries, they plundered monasteries and threatened to obliterate all traces of cultural refinement. Yet Christianity continued as a dominant cultural force for more than 1,000 years to come. Anglo-Saxon literature often focused on great heroes such as Beowulf, though sometimes it addressed everyday concerns too. You see, the early literature of the Anglo-Saxon period mostly took the form of lengthy epic poems, praising the deeds of heroic warriors. These poems reflected the reality of life at this time, which was often brutal. However, the context in which these poems were delivered was certainly not grim. In the great mead halls of kings and nobles, Anglo-Saxons would gather on special occasions to celebrate in style. They feasted on pies and roasted meats, heaped high on these platters, warmed themselves before a roaring fire, and they listened to Scops, professional poets, bring these epic poems to life. Strumming a harp, the Scop would chant in a clear voice that carried over the shouts and laughter of the crowd, and they'd captivate them for hours on end with tales of courage, high drama, and tragedy. To the Anglo-Saxons, these epic poems were far more than simple entertainment. The Scots' performances were a history lesson, a moral sermon, and a pep talk, all rolled into one that instilled cultural pride in teaching how a true hero should behave. At the same time, in true Anglo-Saxon fashion, the Scot reminded his listeners that they were helpless in the hands of fate, and that all human ambition would end in death. With no hope for an afterlife, only an epic poem could provide a measure of that immortality through those heroes. These epic poems were an oral art form, memorized and performed, and they weren't written down. Later, as Christianity spread through Britain, literacy spread too, and poems were more likely to be recorded. In this age, before printing presses, however, manuscripts had to be written out by hand, copied slowly and laboriously by scribes. Thus, only a fraction of Anglo-Saxon poetry has survived, and manuscripts produced centuries after the poems were originally composed. The most famous survivor is the epic Beowulf, about a legendary hero of the northern European past. In more than 3,000 lines, Beowulf relates to the tale of a heroic warrior who battles monsters and dragons to protect the people. Yet Beowulf, while performing superhuman deeds, is not immortal. His death comes from wounds incurred in his final great fight. Additionally, while epics such as Beowulf gave Anglo-Saxons a taste of glory, Scots also sang shorter lyric poems such as The Seafarer that reflected a more everyday reality. The wretchedness of a cold, wet sailor clinging to his storm-tossed boat, the misery and resentment of his wife, left alone for months or years, not knowing if her husband would ever return again. Some of these poems mourn loss and death in the mood of grim fatalism typical of early Anglo-Saxon times. Others, written after the advent of Christianity, express religious faith or offer moral instruction too. A manuscript known as the Executor Book contains many of the surviving Anglo-Saxon lyrics, including more than 90 riddles, such as this one. Wonder was on the wave when water became bone. Water was on the wave when water became bone. The answer? It's an iceberg. These riddles were also used when meetings came together to add to that environment. Most Old English poems are anonymous. One of the few poets known by name was the monk called Cadman, described by the Venerable Bede in his famous History of England. Like most scholars of his day, Bede wrote in Latin, the language of the Church. It was not until the reign of Alfred the Great that writing in English became to be widespread, in addition to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was written in the language of the people. Alfred encouraged English translations of the Bible and other Latin works too. As England moved into the Middle Ages, and as we'll see, its literature continued to capture the rhythms of everyday life. The medieval period was one of social turbulence and unrest, and several works give modern readers a glimpse of the individual hopes and fears of people of the time. Marjorie Kemp, for example, describes a crisis of faith brought by childbirth. The letters of Margaret Paston and her family mainly deal with issues of marriage and managing the family estate too. So you can see that these two concepts, this epic tradition where we read Beowulf in the Iliad, and then this reflection of common life, the actuality, too, come together to create unique literature. Folks, make sure that you watch this video. Again, if you need to get all the information in, it might take you a couple times as you get started using the new format, and be sure to turn in your Cornell notes too. Reach out if you have any questions. Your instructors are here to help, and we'll see you next time.